Iran. And so some of the young people took it upon themselves to start this newspaper in response. So again, here we see it's very reflective of the rigid ideological stance or the relationship that Iran takes towards Israel. Here we see an Israeli soldier, quickly licking the Palestinian ice cream. Geopolitical relationship is a different story. So first, we have to acknowledge that both Iran and Israel are very similar. They're both non-Arab powerhouses in the Middle East. And in some senses, they feel superior to their Arab neighbors, even if this is not in the official guidelines of either country. And of course, they also portray their strategic conflicts in an ideological clash, and both states have their national identity somewhat tied to religion, and at times they share common enemies and allies, which very much informs how they operate in the region. Iran has a love-hate relationship, perhaps in part because of these similarities, has a love-hate relationship with Israel. Of course, on the surface, the official regime guideline is that they're very vocal about being supporter of Israel, and they really, don't ever want to come to table to speak with Israel. But the truth of it is that they really have rarely followed through with that rigid rhetoric. And this very much depends on their interests. So if they're interested in one thing and they're not necessarily competitors in relation to that factor in the region, then they will cooperate. But if they are competitors, then it becomes more complicated. And of course, because the regime is not a monolithic voice, then this becomes this very complicated political dance. Just to give you a few examples, so after 1979 revolution, when Khomeini came, he wanted to make Iran the leader of the Islamic world. And of course, he had to overcome this Arab-Persian divide that was more present during Shah's time. And this is one of the reasons that strategy, again, trumped ideology. Early 1980s, Tel Aviv sends back a number of American-built Iranian tanks that Shah had shipped to Israel. And Iran, of course, accepts. And from there on, Israel remained the intermediary between Iran and the United States throughout the war. Also, early 1980s, Grand Ayatollah Kashani, and I included his title because it's a big deal being a Grand Ayatollah, so he was closely linked to the regime. He travels to Israel as a concerned private citizen. And afterwards, and of course this is not, again, acknowledged, but afterwards Menachem Begin approved the shipment of tires, of Phantoms, and other weapons to Iran. And Ayatollah Khomeini reciprocated by permitting large numbers of Iranians to leave Iran and go to Israel. During Rafsanjani's presidency, which was the 1990s, the policy became that, the rhetoric of course remained the same, but the policy became that they will accept but not support the wishes of Palestinians, which, given the power dynamic and the disparity between United States and Israel and Palestine, that basically meant that what Israel and US says goes, and Palestine here was not really into the formula. Then there were major shifts in the Middle East, and that changed the game a little bit, which unfortunately we can't get into here. So during Khatami's presidency, late 1990s, there were numerous positive gestures made to both United States and Israel. And travel to Israel, for example, became easier. Iranians could go to Istanbul and get their passport and travel to Israel. And but instead of actually a positive response, Netanyahu increased his ideological rhetoric and indicated that Iran is more dangerous than Iraq. And finally, we come to Ahmadinejad's presidency, which is most heard about. And some argue that even the stance that he takes, as harsh and unpopular as they are, is still strategic. For example, the notion that he strategic in the sense that he is questioning things that some argue have long been established. For example, the fact that Israel has settlements. That was something that has always been has been historically settled. It's not a controversy, and so he's bringing controversy to the table just to maybe win some street credit with the Arab population or put pressure on the pro-US Arab regimes. Now, part three, the Iran's Islamic ideology also, of course, plays a role in all of this. Before going into that, I just wanted to point out that even the language that is used is very much informative of the pathologizing and the criminalization that goes on. Oftentimes, the newspapers that I looked at, and I looked at a number of them, use the term hamjinsbaz, just to get it, and I intentionally included that word and didn't switch it because I wanted to be repeated so that it has some sort of an effect on you. So, baz basically is connected to bazi, which means play, and just to further contextualize how it's usually used negatively, like hoqqabaz, which is trickster, and daghalbaz, which is scoundrel, kaftarbaz, which is basically refer to these individuals that are perceived as being part of the lower socioeconomic and sexually predatory, and they are on the ceiling all the time and playing with pigeons. Kaftarbaz literally means playing with pigeons. They're flying them. I'm sorry, I forgot my water. I'm going to steal a few minutes, otherwise I can't talk. Okay, so instead, hamjinsgera is something that's perceived as more positive. Gera refers to tendencies, and this is the term that's used in the Iranian queer communities, and I think one newspaper used it. Okay, so in order to again, this is, of course, just one narrative and not the whole picture, but I went to the source. I guess the Qom Seminary has set up a website to answer questions if there are any doubts about theological doubts. And somebody had asked that if hamjinsbazi is wrong. And so the response goes through the whole list of, how it's against your health, how it's against normalcy, why would God create a punishment for something if it's not bad? So they also engage in this circular argument of, if it wasn't bad, God wouldn't create a punishment, and it is unhealthy. Then also to reflect on how hamjinsbazi is reflected in some of the newspapers. And this is, again, the Islamic Republic newspaper, and it's reporting on a mosque being opened for hamjinsbazan. And there are exclamation points after, reporting that this mosque has been opened in Paris for hamjinsbazan. The exclamation point basically implying that clearly the reader realizes how ridiculous this is. And throughout the article, they don't refer to this building as mosque, but they refer to it as a temple or a place of prayer. And finally, they conclude that, this is a scheme that enemies of God have created. Wow, I'm going to actually skip all of this. I'm so sorry. And go to the last part. So just to go into how homosexuality is reported in relation to Israel. So this is Mashreq newspaper, and as you see, they use the term hamjinsgera, and they report on Michael Oren's statement of how Israel is such a haven. Javan reports the same thing. This is Raja News, which is a conservative newspaper, and Raja News basically goes into how Israel has admitted, as if they had anything to hide, that their image is negative and they're making porn movies, and they link pornography to homosexuality and say that this is why. So out of a number of newspapers that I looked at, only one of them in one sentence said that this is done but to take away attention from the Palestinian and Israeli conflict, but they also really didn't get into any kind of analysis or contextualize it. So all of the newspapers either sounded like the Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs, in Persian, using terms like hamja and skera, and just basically reporting, or they presented it in a very negative, that narrative of deviance and sickness. And some, of course, can say that this is also strategy, but it's a strategy that we have to look at what is the value of it, because Israel doesn't have to do anything to other Iran. Iran is, in a sense, self-othering by presenting or making alliances with a space that sees sexuality as the dichotomy of sickness versus health. So, wow, that was so fast. One point that I want you to go with is that I guess in order for any kind of movement to come out of Iran, they have to have an anti-homophobic, any kind of movement that addresses the hypocrisy that goes on, or the contradiction that goes on in relation to Israel supporting gay rights and being this haven of human rights. They have to first address their own homophobia and be anti-homophobic. But my large vision for this project is informed by Caitlin Behringer's article, The Life Cycle of a Common Weed, Viral Imaginings in Plant and Human Encounter. In the article, Susan Stryker, thank you for making us read that. That's my professor. Sorry, I had to show off. Okay. So she, in this article, tells us that she has hepatitis C. And in order to treat her illness, she discovers that a dandelion is a very natural remedy for hepatitis C. But then she realizes that her blood fertilizes dandelion. And so she shifts her disease into this relationship, into that her blood feeds the plant that eases her dis-ease. And so I just want us to think about what can we do in the context of civil societies and communities to shift this relationship and animate a different kind of relationship that would go towards social movement. Thank you.
Blair Kuntz has been the Near and Middle Eastern Studies librarian at the University of Toronto since 2003. He has conducted research on library censorship, Palestinian and Kurdish publishing, and cultural genocide, and e-learning, period. Blair is currently researching Western feminist and queer collaboration with Empire. Please welcome Blair.
How do I get it to go bigger?
Yeah, you can go down to where it says 74%.
Right there?
See where it says 74% at the very bottom?
The very bottom? Yeah? Nope. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
Oh, I see that one. Okay. So you can see my title is a bit different than what's in the program because I have added the qualifier and shoot them wearing ski masks in Tel Aviv. All right, so I'll begin. In the wake of the Second Palestinian Intifada of 2000, the subsequent illegal American-led invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003, and the ongoing crusade to attack Iran, Western apologists for invasion and occupation manipulated Western countries' supposed tolerance for women's rights and same-sex rights in order to justify both Israel's brutal and ongoing repression of Palestinian and illegal Western military aggression. In the arena of presumed Western tolerance for same-sex sexual behavior, Western apologists sought to propagandize such hypothetical tolerance for same-sex rights as evidence of Western moral superiority, an assumption which flew in the face of the West's own participation in and perpetration of war crimes. In particular, those apologists wishing to demonstrate alleged Western moral superiority singled out the gruesome July 19, 2005 hanging execution in Mashhad, Iran, of 2 teenagers accused of same-sex activity. Due to the secrecy of the Iranian judicial system, specific details of the case remain murky, including the exact ages the 2 youths, Mahmoud Asghari and Ayraz Marhoni, allegedly committed their crimes. Due to international pressure, the Iranian government said both were above the age of 18 when they committed the illegal acts. However, it is more probable that at the time of the incident, the 2 youths were minors, one aged 15 and the other 16. Moreover, in the end, the Iranian government claimed they were executed for raping a 13-year-old boy, another unverifiable claim due to the non-transparent and unreliable nature of the Iranian legal system. From an account that emerged after the executions, 5 boys, aged 13, 14, 15, 15, and 17, had been found fondling each other in a semi-public area. According to the same account, the boys knew each other and possibly had engaged in same-sex relations before. While human rights groups claim that Iranian citizens had been executed for engaging in same-sex relations before and after the incident, Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad assertions to the contrary, the shocking pictures of the execution went viral, prompting vociferous denunciations of the Iranian government. We may also suggest that Western and Israeli apologists used this incident, and others to mislead Western opinion in order to demonize the Iranian regime, just as they had earlier used false allegations of non-existent Iraqi weapons of mass destruction to invade Iraq in 2003, in order to prepare the ground for a possible invasion of Iran. Right-wing pundits even used the incident to argue that buying carbon-intensive so-called ethical oil from the Canadian tar sands was morally superior to buying oil from a country which executes gays. Zionist apologists, meanwhile, used the event to demonstrate Israel's laws selectively protecting certain same-sex rights as an example of Israel's moral superiority in contrast to its barbaric and hopelessly backward neighbors, a transparent and convenient moral claim used, naturally, to justify Israel's ongoing dispossession and repression of Palestinians. For instance, pro-Israeli groups such as the Jewish Defense League, a group accused by the FBI of plotting and executing terrorist attacks inside the United States, demonstrated outside pro-Palestinian events holding signs denouncing Islamofascism and screaming, "They hang homosexuals in Iran." And I heard this myself, so this is how they said it. "They hang homosexuals in Iran." Okay. It must be stated that members of what Joseph Massad has dubbed the Western Gay International willingly participated in the media and manipulation. This new and frankly suspicious concern for same-sex rights in Iran must be seen for what it is, a pretext, one in a long line of so-called humanitarian pretexts used to justify Western invasion, occupation, and destabilization. For example, the newfound concern the United States found for Mosquito Indians in order to destabilize the democratically elected Sandinista government in Nicaragua in the 1980s, and the newfound concern for Kosovo Albanians used to justify the bombing of the former Yugoslavia into submission in 1999. Surely this incident and its subsequent exploitation as a propaganda tool is a case in which we should attempt to understand the full picture. For instance, one might well ask what is missing in Western and Israeli apologists' focus on decrying the Iranian government's execution of the 2 youths for alleged same-sex activity. Certainly focusing on capital punishment based on sexual orientation avoids discussion of other reprehensible factors involved in the incident, namely the application of the death penalty itself, and also the fact that the death penalty was applied against juveniles. If we scrutinize all 3 transgressions separately and contrast Iran with the West in these cases, we find that Western and Israeli claims to moral superiority do not bear scrutiny, particularly when a more complete picture might ask how American and Israeli interference and support for dictatorship in the Middle East, in particular the CIA-backed 1953 overthrow of the democratically elected and liberal government of Mohammad Mossadegh, has worked to impede social and political progress. The subsequent support of the repressive regime by the Shah, by both the United States and Israel, which provided arms and military intelligence and helped to train the notorious secret police of Savak in torture and interrogation techniques, surely leads one to ask the question, might Iran have been a very different place today had it not been for such nefarious and immoral Western interference? We might also contrast American support for and silence over appalling and reprehensible human rights abuses committed by its reliable ally Saudi Arabia, in contrast to the censure meted out to Iran. In the application of the death penalty, for instance, the United States is a consistent presence on any annual list of countries carrying out the most executions, ranking 5th, enjoying the company of such obvious, odious violators of human rights as Saudi Arabia, yes, Iran, North Korea, China, and Yemen. Besides Japan, the United States is the only country in the industrialized world still adhering to the death penalty, while it remains one of the few countries in the Americas to carry out the practice. Then, too, any discussion of the death penalty in the United States must go hand in hand with the discussion of that country's criminal justice system, which sees the United States as holding 25% of the world's prison population, even though it contains only 5% of the world's population, making it the most populous jailer in the world. Indeed, private for-profit prison building is one of America's fastest-growing industries. Like the death penalty, America's criminal justice system is rife with racism and classism, with poor people and racial minorities forming the majority of inhabitants of both the prison system and death row. With the publication of the prison pictures emanating from the American abuse at the Iraqi prison at Abu Ghraib, the world, in fact, witnessed the export of the truly appalling conditions prisoners endure in American prisons in the United States, including its truly abhorrent policy of solitary confinement. Indeed, American journalist Shane Bauer, who spent 4 months in an Iranian prison under solitary confinement, stated that, in contrast to American cells, at least his Iranian cell had a window. As for Israel, although it has formally outlawed capital punishment, its practice of extrajudicial killing and assassination has drawn the opprobrium of many human rights groups and amounts to premeditated murder. Israeli government or military officials rarely produce evidence demonstrating that targeted individuals acted violently or threatened Jewish citizens. From September 2000 to June 30th, 2008, Israel carried out 755 targeted killings, 530 of which were extrajudicially targeted, and 233 were bystanders. Although America pays lip service to concern for children, the United States incarcerates more of its children than any other country in the world. Nearly 500,000 American children currently reside in juvenile detention centers. Courts in America are permitted to sentence children convicted of homicide to life without parole in adult prisons. Actually, the Supreme Court of the United States only abolished the death penalty for acts committed as juveniles on March 1st, 2005. At the time, the United States was only one of 7 countries in the world since 1990 to have executed juvenile offenders. Even so, the United States still incarcerates children without arrest, while many children in juvenile detention centers go on to populate adult prisons. The United States is one of only 3 nations that have refused to ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Today, 20% of American children live in poverty. America's scrupulous concern for the rights of children during its self-declared war on terror is evidenced in its treatment of Omar Khadr, a Canadian citizen captured in Afghanistan in 2002 at the age of 15 while fighting for the Taliban, an entity which was once allied with the United States. Khadr was subsequently detained, interrogated, and sent to Guantanamo Bay, and was the first person since the Second World War to be prosecuted in a military commission for crimes committed as a child. Then, too, we have the example of the targeted assassination in Yemen of American citizen 16-year-old Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki on September 30th, 2011, 2 weeks after the extrajudicial assassination of his father, Anwar al-Awlaki, also an American citizen, who was allegedly killed because of terrorist activities. Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki's only crime was to be his father's son. Moreover, when American allies such as Saudi Arabia, which also condemns same-sex acts as a capital offense, beheads minors for under less than transparent legal proceedings, the United States remains mum. For instance, on January 9th, 2013, Saudi Arabia beheaded Sri Lankan maid Rizana Nafik for allegedly killing a baby in her care in 2005. At the time of the incident, Nafik was only 17 years old. However, when Hillary Clinton, supposed Western feminist icon, visited Saudi Arabia as Secretary of State in March 2012, she breathed not a word concerning Nafik, although she did apparently find the courage to bare her ankles to her Saudi hosts. Similarly, when the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child reported on February 2013 that the United States had killed hundreds of Afghan children in the last 4 years, The United States cynically responded that the report was categorically unfounded. The United States' scrupulous attention to the rights of the child might best be summed up by American Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's reply in 1996 concerning whether 500,000 Iraqi children was a price worth paying as a result of Western-imposed economic sanctions. "We think the price is worth it," Albright replied without blinking. Meanwhile, the fruits of Western-imposed Iraqi occupation and repression, including the use of depleted uranium and white phosphorus, come home to roost as a 2013 report notes a huge increase in birth defects. Indeed, American disregard for the lives of children served as one of the reasons why queer American hero Bradley Manning, whose treatment at the hands of the American military has been met with appalling silence by members of the Western Gay International. This was one of the reasons he gave for releasing a confidential material to whistleblower media outlet WikiLeaks. As for Israel's regard for the rights of children, it can only be said that since September 29, 2000, first, Israel has killed 516 Palestinian children. As researcher Catherine Cook notes, the majority of Palestinian children were killed and injured while going about normal daily activities such as going to school, playing, shopping, or simply being in their homes. During the Israeli attack on Gaza from December 2008 to January 2009, 318 Gazan children were killed, and currently 194 children, 30 of them under the age of 16, are held in Israeli prisons. Indeed, an April 2008 report estimated that more than 7,000 Palestinian children had been arrested since the outbreak of the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Meanwhile, Palestinian children are more likely to suffer levels of malnutrition, poverty, psychological trauma, and other health effects. The charge of Iran's use of capital punishment on the basis of sexual orientation is another area in which Western criticisms do not bear scrutiny. In fact, American invasion and occupation helped to retard rather than improve same-sex rights around the world. For instance, after America's invasion of Iraq in 2003, Shia death squads began carrying out sexual cleansing of gays. Under the regime of Saddam Hussein, gays had enjoyed a degree of tolerance, or at least indifference, but during the American occupation, Iraqi gays found that Americans, in actions reminiscent of the liberation of the death camps at the end of the Second World War, when American soldiers beheld concentration camp prisoners wearing a pink triangle with horror and promptly reprisoned them, looked the other way. The May 2001 arrest of 52 gay men on the Queen boat in Cairo was followed by a witch hunt against gays by the government of Hosni Mubarak. However, as dictator Mubarak was about to be overthrown, thank you. As he was about to be overthrown, American Vice President Joe Biden proclaimed his undying loyalty for the American sycophant, declaring, "Mubarak has been an ally of ours on a number of things. I would not refer to him as a dictator." 2 years after the American-supported overthrow of democratically elected progressive Honduran President Manuel Zelaya on June 2009, McClatchy newspapers reported that paramilitaries had killed 59 gays, lesbians, and transgendered people. Finally, when a Ugandan newspaper in 2010 recalled for gay people to be hanged, supporting a government bill calling for the death penalty for repeated same-sex relations, the move was largely inspired by a group of American Christian fundamentals. So I'm going to just speak extemporaneously, if that's how you say it, from now, because I'm ran out of time. But I just found it very interesting that, for all the talk of the hanging in Iran, that 2 months ago, on February 4th, 2013, an Oregon resident hung himself due to repeated anti-gay bullying. It was Jaden Bell, who was only 17 years old. And finally, we come to the August 2nd, 2009 shooting at a gay and lesbian center by a suspect wearing a ski mask, which killed 2 and wounded, I think it was 17 people. And in this instance, Benjamin Netanyahu chose to single out Israel for its strict adherence to morality. Of course, Israel's always complaining that they're always being singled out, but he has no problem singling Israel out for its morality. So he said, "We are a democratic and tolerant country, in contrast to Israel's unenlightened and intolerant neighbors," he might have added, "and we must respect every person, as he is." So this is in spite of the fact that prominent right-wing Israeli settler proponents, whose denunciations of homosexuals resembles those of Iran's Ayatollahs, sit in the Israeli Knesset. And in fact, they are linked to Netanyahu through their support for their common support for the settler project in Israel. So I'll just go to my conclusion. It is, of course, an old colonial game and an old Orientalist trope, this appeal to civilizational and moral superiority to justify repression, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. We can change and evolve, but they can't. However, moving on beyond such nebulous notions to historical fact, a different picture emerges. Since its inception as a nation, for example, the United States, a state founded on the genocide of its indigenous inhabitants, has invaded and attacked other countries in numbers almost too innumerable to mention, while Israel, founded on the ethnic cleansing of its Palestinian population, has attacked Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Iraq, Tunisia, Sudan, and Jordan. In contrast, Iran, despite the admittedly horrific human rights abuses committed by the Islamic Republic, has neither invaded nor attacked any other country. Thank you.
So for our last presenters, the Raha Iranian Feminist Collective is a New York-based group of Iranian and Iranian Americans founded in 2009 to stand in solidarity with Iranians' democratic uprising while opposing U.S. military and economic interventions. They also seek to counter misconceptions about Iran and what it means to be anti-imperialist. Understanding that patriarchy and militarism go hand in hand, they seek to challenge the different ways they operate in both the US and Iran. They work to raise awareness about movements for justice in Iran and the US through internal education, creative messaging, solidarity actions, and public education.
Hi.
Please welcome the Raha.
I'm going to do the mic test too. This is okay? Okay. So good morning. It feels almost like it should be afternoon by now. We're Raha, as Roya just mentioned, and we're a small portion of a larger group. So it's unusual to have this many at once, but there could be even more. So we've spared you a little bit. All right. So we've also changed the title of our piece. The title you have in the program is from our proposal many months ago. The new title is Politics of Solidarity, Politics of Sexuality, Beyond the Framework of Identity. Yeah?
I just wanted to make sure, is the live stream on?
So we've triple checked at this point.
I've triple checked and it's only the audio right now.
I just want to make sure that
Thanks.
friends.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
That's why I kind of ran off stage. I just wanted to triple check before we.
Yeah. That's also we weren't all trying to be rude to each other by sitting in the audience. Some people don't want to be heard on the audio stream, so that's what's happening. So Politics of Solidarity, Politics of Sexuality, Beyond the Framework of Identity. Since 2007, when Ahmadinejad declared in an interview with the president of Columbia University that, quote, there are no homosexuals in Iran, he has been asked repeatedly about the status of gays and lesbians in Iran. In an interview with CNN in 2012, Piers Morgans asked Ahmadinejad, quote, shouldn't freedom and individuality and all those things also extend to those people who happen to be gay, who were born gay, they weren't made gay? Wouldn't it be great for the president of Iran to say, something? Everyone's entitled to their own sexuality they are born to. That would be a great symbol of freedom, end quote. This line of questioning is in many ways a sign of the success of a particular segment of the US LGBT movement and of the incorporation of a specific conception of gay rights into mainstream US discourses. This success has been based on an argument that gays and lesbians are simply born this way, with the corollary assumption that homosexuality is an ahistorical and acultural phenomenon that happens consistently in all times and places. While it is admitted that the rate of self-declared gay or lesbian identity may be much lower than the presumed norm, the assumption is that in such cases, repressive cultural forces keep this natural homosexuality latent. This image of human sexuality is incredibly flat and sanitized, indeed desexualized, lacking any notion of the dynamic social, cultural, and interpersonal factors that shape our experiences of our sexualities in a range of ways. It is also politically an extremely short-sighted approach with widespread harmful effects that presents an impasse for achieving a politics of solidarity in relation to the struggles around same-sex intimacy and sexual relations in Iran.
We, as members of Raha Iranian Feminist Collective, are sensitive to the fact that in the US today, the politicization of issues of same-sex intimacy in Iran has emerged from how a specific US domestic LGBT rights discourse has become enmeshed with a US global neo-colonial project. As a result, it is exceedingly difficult to find the political space in which to articulate nuanced positions on Iran without them becoming fodder for anti-Iranian rhetoric in the service of war. We push back against both the simplistic representation of Iran in popular US discourses and a narrow framing of sexual liberation within the dominant LGBT rights movement.
We ask, how might we imagine a politics of solidarity in this polarized context that is not based on a presumed universal sexual identity, namely gay, lesbian, or bisexual? We propose to move beyond the framework of sexual identity, shifting to a more broadly conceived politics of sexuality. Every society regulates sexuality and imposes hierarchies of sexual relations and behaviors. In addition, all states control sexual relations in order to promote specific forms of intimacy and kinship. This means that today's dominant Euro-American LGBT politics is only one of a possible range of political engagements with the regulation of sexuality. A broader politics of sexuality and solidarity would address state and cultural practices related to a range of issues such as marriage, cohabitation, being single, sex outside marriage, the sexuality of children, non-normative sexual practices, intimacies of various kinds, sexual violence, violence against the sexually marginalized, the organization of family and child care, and birth control, abortion, sterilization, and other fertility practices. We want to recognize that at various times and places, the sexually marginalized gather and mobilize to change their marginality, and in more radical versions, the conditions of the marginality of themselves and of others.
A politics of solidarity is not a politics of aid, compassion, and rescue, but a politics of common struggle of differently situated people for a shared vision of justice and freedom. We furthermore propose a feminist politics of sexuality that engages with the entanglement of gender and sexuality without reducing them to each other. Such politics can benefit from the richness of feminist thought on reproduction, family, marriage, and the state. A feminist politics of sexuality helps us to make linkages between issues and contexts in a way that is dynamic and non-reductive.
In the service of this goal of shifting the framework from a politics of identity to a feminist politics of sexuality, specifically in relation to the question of same-sex sexual intimacy in Iran, we propose the following do's and don'ts for activists. Don't project your definitions, values, or understandings of sexualities and identities onto others, including Iranians. Language matters, but it's imperfect. And so identity labels can be helpful in making ourselves intelligible to others, but they can also prove limiting or harmful. Someone who identifies as gay may not associate their sexual identity with the same cultural meanings and social norms that you do, or share your perspective on how their sexuality fits into their lives. They may also not see increased visibility of their experience and desires as a means to achieving greater freedom. On the other hand, do not assume that people in Iran are necessarily vastly different from yourself. Similarly, cultural practices and meanings inevitably vary from context to context. In Iran, for example, same-gender intimacy has different meaning than in the United States, and in fact, it's not uncommon, gay, or deviant for two men to show their affection by hugging, kissing, or holding hands, even if those men are homophobic. And it's not uncommon for such men to be shocked by the regulation of male touch in the US from American men who, ironically, claim to not be homophobic. When we start from the perspective of Iranians, we might see that Iranian social norms that allow for same-gender intimacy offer differently structured possibilities and limitations for same-gendered sexual intimacy in Iran.
So do situate yourself, who and where you are and whom you are addressing. In many cases, sentiments against Iranian state homophobia are not heard and heeded by the Iranian regime or even the Iranians you aim to support, but rather by those in your own communities. How might these sentiments exoticize, polarize, or racialize? How we talk, when, where, and about whom have political implications which are not always obvious, implications that can actually be in opposition with stated solidarity goals. With that in mind, situate not only yourself, but also the information you encounter. Where have you encountered your knowledge about Iran and how was it presented to you? How will you interpret and engage with this information? As Iranians and Iranian Americans speaking from the US, we resist pressures to provide authentic insider accounts of non-normative sexualities as lived in Iran, as we ourselves are living in the US, and we can never adequately encapsulate the complex, malleable experiences of others. This is not a hollow or culturally relativistic position, but rather one which acknowledges and values the places where we have the most impact and influence.
Do you recognize the regulation of sexuality that happens in different ways in your own culture and society? It may be true that we have more of certain kinds of sexual freedoms in the US than in some other places, but our sexualities are being used as a means to shape us into consumers and neoliberal political subjects. The US society's relative sexual liberalism is produced and mobilized through representations of sexuality in the media in the service of capturing audience attention and selling products. The recent successes of the fight for same-sex marriage are facilitated by the recognition of the economic benefits of marriage promotion from the perspective of state and business interests. If we recognize the regulation of sexuality that happens in our own society, it would also allow us to make connections between Iran and the US, for example, in the different ways in which transsexuality and its relationship to homosexuality is conceived and regulated. In both cases, the medicalization of transsexuality creates both the possibility of existence for many trans people in these societies, while also enmeshing people in deeply regulative and controlling systems. This medical model seeks to perpetuate binaries of gender, and in the Iranian case, binaries of sexuality.
Don't speak about Iran in the present tense without an understanding that their history is informing both the Iranian context and your lens on Iran. While US perceptions of Iran have been deeply shaped by the Iran hostage crisis, for Iranians, the pivotal experience shaping their perceptions of the US was the 1953 CIA-backed coup of Prime Minister Mossadegh following the nationalization of the oil industry. Recognize also that the current framing of the region as repressing sexuality is a pendulum shift. In fact, historically, European Orientalists traveling accounts of Iran and other regions of the Middle East represented the region as a place of perverse sexualities, which was seen by some Europeans seeking same-sex as a space of uncharted freedoms.
Do make links through recognition of the relationship between nationalism and the regulation of sexuality in many countries. Feminist analysis of nationalism leads us to better understand the stakes of the nation-state, whether it's the US or Iran or Israel, in the regulation of sexuality. Nationalism of any kind and its corollary politics of cultural authenticity makes claims to superiority based on the nation's or culture's supposed authentic sexual mores. It also erases the existence and struggles of people who challenge the sexual hierarchies and norms of their nations or cultures. We see this operating in Iran, in Israel, and in the US, although with different inflections. Therefore, homonationalism is a particular political incarnation of this long-standing relationship between nationalism and sexuality, where claims of national superiority rely on the existing or imagined sexual norms of particular groups.
Don't perpetuate Islamophobia or racism by casting homophobic practices as unique to or especially egregious among Muslims. Indeed, this discourse of Islamic exceptionalism has become part of right-wing warmongering. In the 2011 Pride Parade in San Francisco, a supposed human rights group called Iran 180 organized a float where a man initially seeming to be a prisoner of gruesome-looking puppet of Ahmadinejad turns into a dominatrix and forcibly sodomizes Ahmadinejad with a nuclear missile. We have to wonder what this violent and ironically homophobic imagery during a queer celebration does other than to contrast our freedoms with their barbarity. This racism does nothing to transform the regulation of sexuality in Iran. Rather, it is part of a US nation-building project that incorporates queers in the service of opposing an imagined unified us against an equally imagined uncivilized other.
do recognize that Islamic beliefs and practices are a realm of interpretation and contestation. What is often taken to be a manifestation of Islam, in fact, must be analyzed in relation to other social, economic, and political factors. For example, some represent reports of executions of men on sodomy charges in Iran as evidence of the natural outcomes of the politicization of Islam. While these reports are deeply disturbing, they must be understood in relation to Iran's broader use of the death penalty in the service of the protection of state interests. Are these practices derived from Islam? In fact, if you look at the cases, courts generally do not follow Islamic legal standards in determining the validity of the charges, and the forms of executions, e.g. by hanging, are not prescribed by the Quran, but came to Iran via the West as a means to modernize the Iranian legal system. More broadly, it is imperative to address these executions in the context of the Iranian state's use of the death penalty, a practice that has waxed and waned over the last several decades, greatly increasing in times of greater political repression, including in the last several years.
Don't imagine that in this political moment, international pressure on the Iranian government will be an effective means for increasing sexual freedom in Iran. It is true that the possibilities for sexual liberation in Iran are shaped by both domestic factors and the larger geopolitical context. While people fighting for greater freedom in Iran are fighting a conservative and repressive regime, outside pressures on that regime have only made these local struggles more challenging. The great expansion of the sanctions regime is significantly worsening already dire social and economic circumstances in Iran. Furthermore, threats from the outside both create greater state repression domestically and also foster nationalism that is antithetical to the growth of liberation movements. Indeed, international antagonism contributes to a polarized framing within Iran that further legitimates state repression against non-normative sexualities that are cast as a threat to national interest and national identity.
And do recognize where your power will be most effective. The consequences of your political actions have more of an impact in your local or national context. So when you speak, consider what your impact could be in your specific context. For those of us who do our activism in the US, recognizing our own power and responsibility in relation to different oppressive forces would lead us to see that we must work to oppose sanctions, war, and warmongering, not only because they are directly destructive, but also because they strengthen the Iranian regime's hold on people. Let us repeat. Our most important job here is to oppose sanctions, war, and warmongering. It is only on that basis that we can begin to imagine the next steps in a politics of solidarity, or more specifically, a politics of sexuality, one that is built around creating linkages of support for each other as we seek to understand both the differences and the commonalities in our struggles. Thank you. And we should also mention that Raha has a website, and so you can follow some of our actions and the things that we're doing. And that's rahacollective.org. That's RAHA collective, all one word, .org. Thank you.
So do all the panelists want to come up? I really want to thank the audience for your patience as we worked through the technical issues, and also to thank all of the panelists. And your papers really helped me understand why I felt so very uncomfortable with the title of this panel. So I really appreciate that. And I'm going to restrict my comments because we don't have that much time, so I want to go ahead and go straight into discussion. But before we do, I just want to highlight that I think the challenge at hand is to find a way to effectively address kind of what Blair called the Western Israeli claims of moral superiority, while still holding space in our analysis to call for accountability around state violence, instantiated through prisons, executions, war. And I really encourage all of us to think through the guidelines the Raha Feminist Collective presented in terms of in our comments and in our brief discussion that we're about to share with each other, to really be mindful of where our comments come from and situate ourselves in terms of who we're addressing and what our individual and collective investments are in Iran. So, great. So I'll just go ahead and open up to questions. I have. Just takes a second sometimes. It's just audio live stream now. Okay, well, can you guys maybe talk a little bit about how you came together and the context of that? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
So thank you very much. I have one question from Tahereh. I didn't really understand where you were discussing the bra shops and the homosocial space. How you were relating it to the hegemonic LGBT organization discourse in the West, because you were kind of trying to say, if I didn't get it wrong, those depoliticized communal spaces, homosocial spaces, might become under scrutiny of the state, or something like that, if I didn't get it wrong. Because I think since it is not happening in the public space, maybe those women in the bra shops are really not aware of what is happening in gay international.
Would you mind like pushing the button on that microphone down? And could you do the other one?
And one question for Alex, that do you think that the Iranian LGBT community, again, can strategically use the international human rights framework or LGBT framework to advance their own causes and to suffer?
So the way it may, no, I can understand how it's unclear, because it's, you know, when you're at a point where there's like so many things in your project and there's like 1 million pages, but you can only read 6 of them. And so you think it all makes sense because in your head you know all the connections, but then you get questions that it's like, oh, that's probably not clear. So the way that I do it in the large project is I use Lefebvre to talk about space, right? Space. So part of that is looking at really quickly for those that don't know about that multiple things produce space, and that space is always in production, right? It's always fluid, it's always moving. So it's the people who enter the space, the politics they come in with, the culture they come in with, their relationships. It's also the architecture of the space. It's also what economically sustains the space. It's a lot of things. So the way that I talk about LGBTQ narratives functioning is as more the possibility of them being able to police how women internally regulate desires and how they understand, how they begin having possibly options of like words to use to speak through things they might be feeling, but where previously that could be a moment that didn't deserve a naming before, right? So this is something that I experienced. I could understand it as desire, I could understand it as excitement, I could understand it as I'm really bored, I just want to get out of here, you know, I want to think of whatever, right? But it's the idea that the possibility for now naming that feeling is available, and then the path that puts you on, right? So that's how I'm talking about LGBTQ narratives sort of policing women, and that what it does when that's happening simultaneously with these neoliberal economic policies that on a purely economic level are really sort of eliminating these raw shops, right? And eliminating spaces for you to have those kinds of interactions, have community, and that what does it mean when the replacements are these things where you're not expected to touch each other, you're not expected to bump into each other, you have a little rack to look through, you have individual dressing rooms, so how that communicates different things about how you understand other women's bodies and your relationship to them as well as your own body.
It's kind of like shifting the way that we're talking about these kinds of questions from being about identity categories and like human rights kind of things and kind of moving it into how these frameworks are actually changing how desire is being shaped. Yeah. In the experiment.
So just to make sure I understand the question. So if the question was or whether the LGBT community was wrong and strategically using the rights of force to their advantage.
The gays and nationalists.
I mean, my sense, I think, my personal sense is that at this moment there doesn't seem to be, and I think sort of the broad premise that the presentation also addressed that as well. There doesn't seem to be a space where that discourse can make headway on this issue, or on the issue of sort of, and I mean, there's ways in which discussions of sexual freedom and sexual rights more broadly can, I think, be applied discursively to the advantage of the emerging LGBT community, but that the gay international terms might not be really strategic, and so then the conversation we've had with contacts who are in sort of gay rights publishing, I don't know, movement, but who are sort of producing the run, has right now that there is a focus on creating social and community spaces, and devoting sort of activist time and energy to other causes, sort of broader issues of sexual freedom and sexual rights.
Yeah, I have a sort of broader question about the movement and what kind of role issues of gender and sexuality play in that movement in terms of the activism as well as the relationship between activists in Iran and the diaspora.
Can I refer it back to the audience? Ali, would you mind just commenting, please? No, but I mean, it's a conversation, and I think that given your interaction,
Hopefully,
if it's okay with the panel. The role of
The
gender.
mics are on for us.
Briefly.
I was not really listening very carefully.
The role of gender in the Green movement.
Okay. Well, but,
Sexuality.
yeah, but I think the Raha
Well,
Feminist
I
Collective
think
is very
both
well
can.
positioned to comment on that.
I mean, I don't know, it's a difficult question. I mean, there's all the things about any social movement and the way when people come to the streets, what kind of spaces open, or like there's a very complex analysis that can be made of that. But if in terms of like visible, like political discourses and claims, like there was none around sexuality, and even with gender, even though like there was as far as I can tell, and even though there was like women were massively present, and in fact, in many instances, much braver than men, even in confrontations with police and all of that. The Green movement, at least, is those times that it was in the streets, and its slogans that did not have gender, also like explicit claims. That's as far as I can right now just think. But it's much more complex than just what gets articulated politically, I think.
Just to add two things, that one is, at the time, I was doing another project about some websites that identify themselves as LGBT websites or some And in some of those websites, they very much, on the websites, reflected the idea that they are also part of the Green Movement. So there may not have been necessarily an official and or a very visible presence, but there were multiple communities and multiple voices that were saying, it's not about these boxes. It's not about Green Movement separate from gay rights, separate from whatever. That this is a struggle that all of us are part of. Also, something to point out is that, for example, one of the symbols, I think in Iran, correct me if I'm wrong, but also outside of Iran, became Neda, who was just as a iconic figure, was a woman, which is something not necessarily a definitive statement by any means, but it is something to bring into the discussion.
Thanks, I really enjoyed that. I'm sort of feeling a little bit too ignorant to ask questions, but so I'll sort of throw out a forward. I'm quite interested in that sort of that historical shift in the way that the West is interpreting the meaning of the veil, and you also mentioned the idea of creating a differentiated sort of clothing stuff. Could you expand on that a little bit for me? So the shifting meanings of the veil in terms of Western interpretations of what the veil meant. Yeah, I guess I was just going to ask you to expand on that story a little.
I'm happy as well to offer more further research around it. But I think, one of the most interesting aspects of it, I think, to me was one of the ones I was pointing out, sort of how how licentiousness and oppression were related, and how sort of over-sexualized Muslim bodies over time became like desexualized or oppressed Muslim bodies, and that kind of shift, which I think was very much related to sort of the gender sexuality politics in Europe and the US as well, and sort of the way sort of the European self-imagination went from understanding itself as sort of Victorian respectability, and then sort of which transformed into sort of sexual freedom there. How the spectacle of the other continued but had to be constantly repositioned, and then you have this kind of structural forgetting of the sort of previous. I think right now we talk about over-sexualized on the body, which makes sense. It wouldn't work in the Western imagination. Even though I think it's the point out elsewhere is that you have these narratives from the beginning of the 20th century where sort of homosexual Europeans were traveling, and you can have these narratives used. We're traveling to North Africa, we're traveling to the Middle East to engage in homosexual tourism because they understood these places were much freer and more open. And I think this went from being a large part of the Western imaginary for the imagination around the Middle East being right now a very, very, it still exists, but it's very, very much part of it.
Ascari? Sexual problems in sorry. I was doing my research, but it mentioned about the chador, about women who lived in homes, and actually it provided a space for them to go out of their homes unidentified. So if they wanted to meet someone for a relationship outside of the normal boundaries of the culture, they could do so. And sometimes I think she mentions that sometimes they would even rearrange their chador so that they could show themselves to another man. So the chador, in that sense, in the pre-European sense, did have a certain amount of freedom. I guess that's not really.
I think Ashburn is that there is no one presentation of veiling or chador, and there are different definitions, obviously, to women, and different reasons to women who use them, and they operate in different manners. And I think what you're referring to, especially during certain parts of the constitutional revolution in the early 1900s, chadors were used as tools by women to move certain things during the revolution or be spaces of sanctuary and activism. So so again, we have to contextualize and be very descriptive in relation to how we are engaging with these symbols and ideas.
Can I add something? Sorry, I just wanted to say, I mean, it's actually maybe not even in response to the question, but of course there are different ways than the one way that hijab or chador is imagined, but also to acknowledge that as a feminist, that, I mean, it has been historically also what women had to wear, and it has also had all sorts of ways of disciplining women's bodies in relation to public space. Just that to critique that Orientalist view of it doesn't necessarily mean that we think, oh, it's what. So.
Well, and there are certain values, right? I think that's part of what we were trying to say. I'm speaking now for myself, not for the collective. But there are certain values, like the term freedom, like what kind of freedom? Sexual freedom, like freedom of a country, freedom of women, like what does freedom mean to an individual? What does it mean in that context? Like this is a value that we are trying to apply. Like you said, you call it a symbol. Like what is it symbolic of? And for who, like we can't, I mean, I can't speak as a woman in diaspora. Like I grew up here. I can't speak to what that means there. I can speak to what it meant to me when I went there. Or what my aunties tell me or something, but I can't, we can't really say.
Which is why it's very contextual.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
And I think especially when thinking about how historical names have shifted, I really think about it. Reading more about the 1930s in Iran is really crucial thing to examine, sort of the forced unveiling of women in Iran, and then. Which is quite interesting because the politics here, of course, really do have at least women. I'm doing it as well. But at the same time, I believe it was actually the National Archive of the site, where it seems that the head of the police, but also the prosecutions, were not were being forced to. And there was an attempt to shift the meaning very in this way. And I think looking back at women's experiences in that how different they were, and how certain narratives portrayed sort of the end of the veil, unveiling, as a moment of liberation, whereas at the same time you have thousands of Iranians who emigrated during this period, and you have largely individual Iranians who moved to Iraq because of these moments. Or you have another set of Iranian women, my own family who refused to leave the house for years. For whom this was a close effect. So I think this is another interesting way to consider when also wasn't during the Muhammad Mustafa he faced opposition because of this from the people who had an effect this course. So that was one of the discovered that in a way justified.
That it should have been able to work itself out by itself, but it was one of the factors for the infighting that may have led to more. It may have made it more easy for the Americans to come in with the CIA and to overthrow Mossad.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we're out of time with our discussion, but I just want to kind of reiterate large points as people are leaving, which is two really excellent points from the panel. One being the importance of language and the dangers of, what you were saying, mistranslating and mislabeling gender identity and sexual practices across different cultural, religious, historical, social contexts. But also how ideas of gay and lesbian, Western concepts of gay and lesbian rights, human rights frameworks can actually not only not result in liberation, but can actually facilitate organized, state-sponsored homophobia, like the kind we have in the US. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you for
We're still on mics, by the way. Still on mics, folks, remember.
Let me give it to you.
I'm sorry.
So if you get the less reading seats, so you can access all the like no stories.
What's today's attempt? Is that
אבל לא למדתי דבר חדש. ממש, אפילו המקרה כביכול, המקרה שהתחילו איתו.
אבל המקרה הזה, כל כך דיברו על זה הרבה.
להגיד שנתיים אחרי.
זה